I wonder how many other ministers have got confetti going on. It's on my computer. Yeah. Some minister friends of mine up in New Hampshire were like, what? Confetti eggs? I'll send you some. So we got on a Zoom call, and they were like, so what do we do? I said, okay. And they smashed eggs over one another's heads, and I said, and it is good. And they said, ah. So there's some confetti, some Texas confetti in New Hampshire this morning. I will begin with a passage of queered scripture. Matthew 6:28 through 33. Why do you worry about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not clothed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will she not much more clothe you, you of little faith? Therefore, do not worry, saying, what will we eat, and what will we drink, or what will we wear? For it is the Gentiles who strive for all these things, and indeed, your holy parent knows that you need all of these things. But strive first for the kingdom and its righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Thus ends our scripture. Consider the lilies. I walked into the grocery store, and there's this whole huge display with these foil-wrapped pots holding these weirdly uniform plants, white trumpet-shaped lilies, all beginning to bloom on schedule. Easter lilies, held captive in plastic pots, tricked to bloom outside of their nature to fit into a seasonal retail calendar. Tomorrow, they'll be marked down, cheap. Most of them will wind up in the trash. A few lucky ones might be returned to the earth, planted in our heavy clay soils up here. They might survive, and if they do, they might choose to bloom again in June, which is when the earth tells them to bloom. Some might have the lucky opportunity to be added to a compost pile. Easter lilies are the fourth most numerous flowering plant sold in the U.S., and it's a really long process to get the bulbs propagated and then tricked into growing and blooming on schedule, and it's a whole lot of foil paper and a whole lot of plastic pots and planting medium. It's a lot of heat for the greenhouses and gas for the trucks to deliver them, and all so that we can have them on time to be beautiful. Because that's really all they're here for, to be beautiful. They smell good, but they have absolutely nothing to do with the Christian Easter, really. There is no scriptural basis for recognizing Easter with bunnies, eggs, or lilies. These are cultural customs, and those are important, but if they don't make sense otherwise, why? Well, like I said to the kids, this is the time of year when the chickens are laying more eggs and the bunnies, well, are being bunnies. This is the time of year when the pagans are ramping up for Beltane in a couple of weeks. Hey, the fullness of spring. But what's with the lilies? We understand the chicks, we understand the bunnies. How did the lilies get linked with Easter? Well, lilies are in the Hebrew and the Christian scriptures. They're there, but they're not linked with the story of Jesus' death and resurrection. It happened later, when the scriptural stories were retold, and the retellers would embroider with new details, and someone added the detail that sweat dripped off of Jesus' body as he hung on the cross, and where the sweat dripped and splashed onto the earth, lilies sprang up and bloomed. So we have lilies on Easter. These white lilies that we have for sale around here are actually native to southern Japan. There is the white, it gets called the Madonna lily, that is native to the Middle East, and that's probably, it looks similar, and it does bloom in late spring, and that's probably the lily that is referred to in Scripture. But let's go ahead. As Rabbi Jesus recommended, let's consider the lilies of our fields. The oxblood lilies, the rain lilies, sometimes they get called fairy lilies. Do we have anything like that up here? Where these are the ones that really do a resurrection act. They put up leaves at one time of the year and then die back, and then you completely forget that there's anything there. And wonder lilies, they get called wonder lilies up here. Okay, surprise lilies, rain lilies, fairy lilies, wonder lilies. Interesting theme. After a rain, they just suddenly spring up out of nowhere. And they push up and they bloom within like 2 days. And then just as rapidly, they die back down. And they let us forget all over again about their miraculous cycles. There are the tiger lilies that you see in the Midwest and the Northeast, and they're so plentiful that you might even mistake them for being a native flower, but they were hitchhikers. Often all you see now is a crumbling chimney and the lilies, and that's all that remains of the old farm that once stood there, the long-gone woman who planted the lilies to try and soften the raw new homestead, trying to make beauty. Well, since then, the orange and brown tigers escaped. Now they're in the ditches alongside the chicory, the blue cornflowers. They hitchhiked too. Their seeds were in the dirt as ballast in the ships from Europe. Immigrants along for the ride. And now they are at home, naturalized here. Consider the white and pink showy blooms rooted in the dirt and gazing at the stars. In my family's yards, we have the elegant pink lady lilies. That's what Aunt Ruth called them. When we see them bloom, we all think of her because she was the first one to show up with the bulbs and plant them. I don't know where she got them, but every year she would divide the roots, the bulbs, and share them with other women in the family so that she, dead now for 50 years, still arises every spring in our garden. Lily bulbs, passed along from woman to woman, generation to generation, our gardens telling the story of who we belong to. In southern gardens, there are the lilies that are called naked ladies because they rise up on these tall stems, no leaves to clothe them modestly. They are showing themselves off in flagrant abandon because it is really all about reproduction. And there are the durable daylilies, which they're a cash crop in southern Michigan. So when I go visit my family, I drive past fields and fields of lilies, all being fattened up to be lifted out of the earth and sold. Consider the lilies. They toil not, neither do they spin, but they show up again and again, blooming out of the dead earth, audacious in their expensive display of petals and stem, reaching up higher to catch the attention of any pollinators or anyone else who might be tricked into propagating their species. Consider the lilies. What was Rabbi Jesus trying to teach with this lesson? I mean, just to quit worrying about our clothing? Yes. And no. Yes, he was challenging the audience to get beyond the limitations of the Mosaic law that kept people separate, and that told observant Jews how they could eat, how they could drink, how they could clothe themselves. But Jesus, being the radical that he was also carefully laying down some very strong anti-imperialist messages. He was reminding those who were listening that their God loved and cared for them and wanted them to be prosperous and free, all while the occupying Romans didn't care a bit about their well-being. Naturally, living in a colonized community under the control of Rome, no one would say that outright. But this is how oppressed and queer people will talk in parables, in stories, in metaphors that will all fly under the radar of the authorities. Well, I don't know what you're talking about. I was just noticing how nice the wildflowers are this spring. Jesus was also teaching people to give up their striving and interrupt that narrative of scarcity. There is enough. Your God will give you enough. Even though we're oppressed, it is enough. So what are we oppressed by these days? What feathers would be ruffled if we were to start acting as if we actually had enough? Enough to thrive, enough to share. Whose voices would grow loud and shrill and tell us, no, there isn't enough. No, you should be afraid. This country is full. Be very afraid. What is oppressing us these days? What illusions would crumble if we became content and simply loved one another well? What would happen if instead of just watching the growing income inequality in this country, what if we reminded one another that the sacred does not live in accumulated wealth? What if we reminded one another that greed really is still a sin against us all? It's a lot to ask of some lilies. But don't be fooled, they are sturdy. And among their most eloquent lessons is that of persistence and generous beauty. They keep showing up. They're lavish in their display. And this is how the lilies have had their way with us. You see, we might consider that we have burdened them with metaphor, but it might be the other way around. You see, lily flowers, they've evolved to lure pollinating insects. They have these lurid petals with pathways that are visible only to bees. And they have these dangling anthers, fat with pollen, ready to dust a dancing bee that passes by. And then there are these damp stigmas just waiting for a nectar-drunk bee to stagger around and stomp on them. The scientists will carefully name each part of the flower, the stem, the leaves, the roots. They will explain all of this in scientific language as though we are somehow ourselves not part of the same mad dash to exchange DNA. But then again, here are all these lilies in our grocery stores, not a bee in sight. And they're doing just fine. Millions of lilies were propagated this year, raised up under exquisite conditions. Every need met. Nutrients, water, stable soil, protection from weather and damaging insects and rot. And the lilies have found a way to reproduce without any assistance of an unpredictable bee, because they have us. By making their flowers just so lovely, by reminding us how our hope must arise again each spring, they have harnessed us, human imagination, human technology, to become incredibly successful as a species. They've leapt across oceans, they're crisscrossing continents with ease, because we have found delight in them. If, for some unreal reason, if we stopped cultivating and selling Easter lilies tomorrow, their species would still have won the reproductive lottery. Because remember, it's all about reproduction. Our Lady of the DNA will remind you of that with a wink and a smile in each flower. Happy Easter, happy Earth Day, for she is risen.